We invite you to look past the headlines and into the heart of the investigations that defy belief. The story we are about to present is a chilling exploration of the thin, porous veil between fiction and reality, a case where a brilliant mind used the power of the written word not to entertain, but to end. It asks a terrifying question. What happens when an author decides to stop writing stories and starts living them? Before we open this dark and unsettling book, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss a single terrifying chapter we have in store. Now, turn the page, quiet your thoughts, and immerse yourself in a tale of ink and blood. This is the case of the final draft. The first murder was a work of art, if one's definition of art included meticulous, macabre stagecraft. The victim was Arthur Poe, the city of Havenwood's most feared literary critic. His pen was a scalpel, and he performed brutal autopsies on novels, dismembering plot and character with a surgeon's cold precision. He was found by his cleaning lady in the one room of his Gothic revival home that was his sanctuary and his armory, his private library. He was seated in his high-backed leather armchair, posed as if in thoughtful repose. A first edition of his namesake's most famous poem, The Raven, lay open in his lap. His eyes were open, staring at the soaring, cathedral-like shelves of books that surrounded him. There was no sign of a struggle, no overt violence, save for a single, almost poetic detail. A single black feather, a raven's feather, had been placed delicately on his chest, and a tiny, precise puncture wound, almost invisible at the base of his skull, was the only indication that his life had been taken, not simply expired. The room was locked from the inside. This was the scene that greeted Detective Isabella, Izzy Rossi, and her partner, Detective Marcus Thorne. The Havenwood Police Department was more accustomed to the messy, passionate crimes of a sprawling city. This was different. This had the chilling stillness of a museum exhibit. Locked room, no obvious weapon, staged body? Thorne grumbled, his large frame seeming to crowd the silent, literary air of the library. This feels like something out of one of these damn books. All we're missing is a detective in a deerstalker hat. Izzy didn't respond. She moved through the room with a quiet reverence, her mind already working, cataloging the details. Her own background was in the arts. She was a voracious reader with a degree in comparative literature, a path she'd abandoned for the more tangible world of police work after a family tragedy. But the language of symbolism, of narrative, had never left her. She saw the open book, the feather, the pose. It wasn't just a murder. It was a statement. It was a story. The initial investigation went nowhere. The cause of death was a custom-made ice pick, so thin it left almost no trace, introduced through the medulla oblongata, causing instant, silent death. The locked room was eventually explained by a simple but clever trick involving a piece of fine thread and a carefully balanced bolt, a method Izzy had read about in a classic detective novel. The killer was clever, precise, and a reader. They canvassed Poe's life, finding a list of enemies a mile long, every author whose work he had savaged in his weekly column. The list was a who's who of the city's literary scene, and it was utterly useless. 2 days later, the story took a stranger, more terrifying turn. A package arrived at the Homicide Division, addressed directly to Detective Isabella Rossi. Inside, wrapped in simple brown paper, was a sheaf of about 20 pages of thick, cream-colored manuscript paper. The pages contained a single chapter of a novel. The prose was magnificent, dense, lyrical, and psychologically astute. It described, in chillingly intimate detail, the murder of a character named the Critic. It described the library, the leather chair, the open book, the raven feather, and the precise, silent method of his death. It was a perfect, word-for-word blueprint of the crime they had just witnessed. The final page contained a single, handwritten sentence in elegant, looping cursive, a first draft. More revisions to come. And at the bottom corner of that page, pressed into the expensive paper, was a single, perfect, bloody thumbprint. "He's writing to us?" Izzy breathed, the pages spread out on her desk like a sacred text. "He's not just committing the murders. He's documenting them. He's turning his crimes into literature." Thorne stared at the pages, his expression a mixture of disgust and disbelief. He's a monster who thinks he's a genius. So what's our next move, Izzy? Do we put out an APB on a guy with a typewriter and a god complex? The thumbprint was run through every database. No match. The paper was a rare, expensive linen blend, hard to trace. The writing style was distinctive, but without a suspect to compare it to, it was just words on a page. The killer had given them everything and nothing. He had created a perfect, closed loop between the crime and the narrative, and they were on the outside, looking in. The second murder came a week later. The victim was Eleanor Vance, a powerful and ruthless literary agent known for her ability to spot commercial success and her utter disdain for anything she deemed unmarketable. She was found in her sleek, minimalist office overlooking the city. Her death was also a scene, a tableau. She was surrounded by a blizzard of paper, hundreds of manuscript pages, all blank, that had been thrown into the air, covering the floor, her desk, her body. She had been strangled with a long silk scarf, the kind she was famous for wearing. Her cause of death was suffocation, choked by the very potential stories she had refused to represent. The next day, a second manuscript arrived on Izzy's desk. Chapter 2. It described the death of the agent in the same exquisitely detailed prose. It depicted the snowstorm of blank pages, the silk scarf, the quiet, desperate struggle. And on the last page, the same elegant sign-off. The plot thickens. And again, the bloody thumbprint. The city of Havenwood, a city that revered its writers, was now being terrorized by one. The media dubbed the killer the author, and a wave of fear and morbid fascination swept through the literary community. Readings were canceled. Book launches were postponed. Everyone was looking over their shoulder. Izzy and Thorne now had a pattern. The victims were not random. They were the gatekeepers of the literary world, the critic who judged the work, the agent who sold it. The killer was targeting those who held the power to validate or reject a writer's life. This was a crusade, an act of bloody revenge against the system. They compiled a list of every writer who had been publicly eviscerated by Arthur Poe and every writer who had been summarily rejected by Eleanor Vance. The list was still massive, but the overlap was smaller. They began the painstaking work of interviewing dozens of novelists, poets, and playwrights. They met with fragile egos, bitter failures, and struggling artists. They found a world teeming with jealousy and resentment, a perfect breeding ground for the kind of rage that fueled these murders. But they found no one who seemed capable of such cold, theatrical violence. Izzy spent her nights immersed in the two manuscripts. She read them over and over, not as a detective, but as a literary analyst. She saw the influences, the Gothic sensibilities of Poe, the psychological depth of Dostoevsky, the detached, precise prose of a modernist master. The writer was no amateur. He was brilliant, a true artist whose talent was as immense as his pathology. It was a small, almost insignificant detail in the second manuscript that gave her the first real lead. The chapter described the view from the agent's office window, the way the late afternoon sun hit the spire of the old university clock tower. The description was so precise, so lyrically accurate, that Izzy felt the writer must have seen it himself. But Eleanor Vance's client list showed no authors who lived in a building with that specific view. The writer hadn't been a client. He must have been in that office for another reason, perhaps for a meeting that had gone badly. They pulled Vance's visitor logs for the months leading up to her death. And there, they found a name that was also on the list of writers Arthur Poe had recently and brutally criticized. Alastair Finch. The name was known only in the most rarefied literary circles. Finch was a novelist of immense critical acclaim and almost zero commercial success. His 3 published novels were dense, philosophical works, praised by academics for their genius and ignored by the public. He was a writer's writer, a recluse who hadn't published anything in 5 years. Arthur Poe's last review of Finch's work had called him a towering intellect who has tragically built his ivory tower on a foundation of unreadable prose. According to the logs, Finch had a meeting with Eleanor Vance a month before her death, a meeting that had apparently not resulted in a contract. They found Alistair Finch living in a dusty, book-crammed apartment in a crumbling pre-war building that overlooked the university. When they knocked, the door was opened by a man who seemed to have stepped out of one of his own novels. He was in his late 40s, tall and gaunt, with piercing, intelligent gray eyes and a mane of untamed, silver-streaked hair. He was wearing a threadbare tweed jacket and an expression of faint, scholarly amusement. "Detectives," he said, his voice a low, cultured murmur. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit from the constabulary? Have my overdue library books finally triggered a full-scale investigation?" His apartment was less a home and more a shrine to the written word. Books were everywhere, stacked on shelves, piled on the floor, teetering on every available surface. The air smelled of old paper, pipe tobacco, and neglect. "We're here to talk about Arthur Poe and Eleanor Vance," Thorne said, his bluntness a stark contrast to Finch's flowery irony. "Ah, yes, the critic and the agent," Finch said, a thin smile playing on his lips. "A tragedy, of course, though one could argue that their respective ends possessed a certain narrative cohesion, poetic justice, perhaps." He was playing with them. He admitted to hating Poe's reviews and being rejected by Vance, but he did so with an air of intellectual detachment, as if discussing the foibles of minor characters in a story. He spoke of them not as human beings, but as symbols, obstacles to true art. Izzy watched him, a feeling of cold certainty growing in her gut. She was face to face with her author. She decided to show him her hand. "We received these," she said, placing a copy of the first manuscript chapter on his cluttered desk. "The writing is magnificent. I was particularly struck by the use of the Virgilian echo in the final paragraph. Not many writers have the skill to pull that off." Alistair Finch looked down at the pages. For the first time, his mask of amused detachment slipped. A flicker of something pride, excitement, recognition flashed in his gray eyes. He looked up at Izzy, and his smile was no longer just amused. It was predatory. "Detective Rossi," he said, his voice a soft purr. "It seems I have finally found an attentive reader." He denied writing it, of course. He claimed he had never seen it before. But Izzy knew. The flash of connection, the shared language of literary analysis, had been as clear as a signed confession. He was the one. But they had nothing. No physical evidence, no witness, nothing but a shared appreciation for a Virgilian echo. As they left his apartment and stepped back into the misty Havenwood streets, Izzy knew the game had just entered a new, more personal phase. The author had found his audience, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that the story was far from over. The interview with Alistair Finch changed the texture of the investigation. It was no longer a hunt for a phantom. It was a duel. Izzy felt as though she and Finch were locked in a silent, intellectual battle, a conversation being conducted across a chessboard of murder and prose. Finch, having been identified, did not retreat into the shadows. Instead, he seemed to relish the attention, the proximity to the one person who seemed to understand the art of his work. He began to toy with them. A week after their interview, a third package arrived for Izzy. This time, it wasn't a manuscript. It was a rare, leather-bound copy of Dante's Inferno. Tucked inside was a postcard of a local landmark, the old, abandoned city abattoir down by the industrial canal. On the back of the postcard was a single, typed word: plagiarist. There was no thumbprint, no signature. It was a clue, a chapter prompt. "He's giving us the next victim," Thorne said, staring at the postcard. "He's telling us what he's going to do before he does it." "He's testing me," Izzy corrected. "He's not just a killer anymore. He's a showman. He's turning this into a collaborative project." The word plagiarist sent them down a new rabbit hole. They began investigating authors who had been accused of literary theft. Their search quickly landed on a man named Julian Croft, a commercially successful, but critically reviled, thriller novelist. Croft's last bestseller had been at the center of a major scandal, with critics and readers pointing out dozens of passages that were strikingly similar to a little-known novel published a decade earlier by an obscure author. Croft had weathered the storm with a team of high-powered lawyers, but the stain of plagiarism had stuck. They put a protective detail on Croft, a move that the arrogant, dismissive author resented. But they knew Finch was too clever to make a direct assault. He was a dramatist. He would be planning a stage. The abattoir. The old slaughterhouse was a rotting cathedral of brick and iron, a place of ghosts and decay. Izzy and Thorne, along with a SWAT team, staked it out. For 2 nights, they watched and waited in the cold, damp silence. On the 3rd night, their vigilance paid off. They saw a figure slip through a broken fence at the rear of the property. But it wasn't Alistair Finch. It was Julian Croft. A text message had been sent to Croft's phone from a burner number. "I know what you did. I have the proof that will ruin you. Meet me at the abattoir. Midnight. Come alone." "It's a trap," Thorne hissed into his radio. "He's luring the victim to the stage." They followed Croft into the cavernous main hall of the slaughterhouse, a vast, dark space where the rusted hooks and chains of a forgotten industry hung from the ceiling like sleeping monsters. They found him standing in the center of the room, looking around nervously. Alistair Finch was nowhere in sight. Suddenly, a series of powerful floodlights, pre-rigged, snapped on, illuminating Croft in a harsh, theatrical glare. A voice, amplified by a hidden speaker system, echoed through the hall. It was Finch's voice, cultured and calm, reading a passage of text. He was reading from Julian Croft's best-selling novel, then reading a passage from the obscure book he had plagiarized, highlighting the theft for his captive audience of one. "A writer's words are all he has," Finch's voice boomed. "They are the purest expression of his soul. To steal them is not just theft. It is a desecration. It is a sin that must be edited." As the word edited echoed, a heavy chain and hook, held by a magnetic lock high in the rafters, was released. It swung down, not at Croft, but at a large stack of wooden pallets a few feet away from him, smashing them to splinters with a deafening crash. It was a warning, a piece of terrifying stagecraft designed to mentally torment his victim. The SWAT team moved in and the spell was broken. They searched the entire building. Alistair Finch was gone. He had likely been in a nearby building, watching the show through binoculars, his voice broadcast from a laptop. He had never been in any physical danger. He had simply written, directed, and produced his next scene, with the police as his unwilling audience. While they had saved Julian Croft, the event was a public humiliation for the department. The author had outmaneuvered them completely. He had proven he could strike whenever and wherever he chose. Izzy knew a direct approach was failing. To catch Finch, she had to understand him not just as a killer but as a writer. She began a deep, obsessive dive into his life and work. She read his 3 published novels, dense and difficult books filled with recurring themes of artistic purity, the solitary genius, and a profound contempt for the mediocre masses. She dug into his past, building a psychological portrait of the man behind the prose. She discovered a lonely, intellectually prodigious childhood. He was the only son of 2 cold, academic parents who had prized his intellect but offered little emotional warmth. His only real human connection had been with his university mentor, a legendary professor of literature named Dr. Elias Vance. Vance had been Finch's champion, the one who had recognized his genius. But Vance had died 10 years ago, falling from a balcony at the university in what was ruled a tragic, alcohol-fueled accident. It was after Vance's death that Finch's career had stalled, and he had retreated from the world. The case was consuming Izzy. Thorne watched with growing concern as his partner's desk disappeared under stacks of literary theory books, and her nights were spent diagramming the narrative structures of Finch's novels. "You're getting too close, Izzy," he warned her one night. "This guy is a narcissistic sociopath. He's not a character in a book. Don't let him pull you into his story." "I have to, Marcus," she replied, her eyes tired but intense. "It's the only way to find out how the story ends." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While the bloody thumbprint had yielded no matches in criminal databases, Izzy had an idea. She sent it to a specialist who had access to sealed academic and archival records. Days later, the specialist called back. They had a match. The thumbprint belonged to Dr. Elias Vance, the professor who had been dead for 10 years. Izzy stared at the report, a cascade of horrifying implications washing over her. The blood on the manuscripts, the killer's signature, wasn't his own. It was his mentor's. She pulled up the cold case file on Vance's death. The details were sparse. He had been hosting a small gathering of his top students in his fourth-floor office. There had been drinking. According to the sole witness, a young, distraught Alastair Finch, the professor had become unsteady, leaned too far over the balcony railing and fallen. It was a tragedy. But now Izzy saw it for what it was. The first murder. The origin story. Finch hadn't just lost his mentor. He had killed him. Perhaps Vance had criticized his work. Perhaps Finch saw it as a necessary act of succession, killing the father to become the master. And he had kept a sample of his mentor's blood, a sacred relic that he was now using as his artistic signature, a grotesque tribute to his first, perfect crime. Armed with this new, explosive information, Izzy felt a shift in the power dynamic. Finch thought he was the one in control, the author of the story. But he didn't realize that his detective was reading his biography, not just his fiction. She decided to write a chapter of her own. The police department, through a press liaison, released a carefully worded statement. They announced a major breakthrough in the case of the author, stating that new forensic evidence had definitively identified the killer. They did not release Finch's name. It was a bluff, a calculated psychological move. Izzy knew that Finch, the ultimate narcissist, would be unable to stand someone else claiming authorship of his story. He would be enraged that the police were trying to write his ending for him. He would feel compelled to respond, to reassert his control over the narrative. The response came 48 hours later. It was the most audacious move yet. A package was delivered not to Izzy's desk, but to her home. Inside was another manuscript. Chapter 4. The prose was different this time, frantic, angry, the elegant control replaced by a raw, burning fury. It described the murder of a character who was a thinly veiled caricature of Izzy herself, the police detective, a woman whose intellectual pride led her to a gruesome end. The final page was a direct challenge. You think you can write my ending? The author is the only one who decides when the story is over. Your final chapter is coming. And for the first time, there were two bloody thumbprints on the page. One belonged to Elias Vance. The other, the police lab quickly confirmed, was a perfect match for Alastair Finch. In his rage, he had made his first mistake. He had signed his name to his work. But the manuscript was also a death threat. The cat-and-mouse game was over. The author had just announced that he was beginning his final and most personal act. The direct threat against Izzy's life threw the department into high alert. A protective detail was assigned to her, and she was officially pulled from the field, ordered to work from a secure room at headquarters. But Izzy knew that Alastair Finch was not a common thug who would attempt a simple drive-by shooting. He was a dramatist, a theatrical producer of death. The final chapter he had promised would be a performance, and the threat was not just a threat, it was a script. "He's not going to come after me," she explained to a tense and worried Thorne. "He's going to build a stage and try to lure me onto it. This manuscript isn't just a threat. It's an invitation. It's a map." She and a small, trusted team, including Thorne, locked themselves away and began to dissect the final chapter manuscript, not as a piece of fiction, but as a blueprint. The story described the police detective following a series of clues, each one leading her deeper into a trap. The narrative was filled with obscure literary allusions, historical references specific to Havenwood, and a series of complex riddles. Finch's arrogance was now his greatest vulnerability. He was so convinced of his own intellectual superiority that he had laid out his entire plan, confident that only he was smart enough to understand it fully before it was too late. The first clue was an allusion to a Borges story about a labyrinthine library. Izzy immediately knew he was referring to the heart of the university's rare book collection, a maze of towering shelves in the oldest part of the campus. The manuscript described the detective finding a specific book, a 17th century treatise on alchemy. Inside, a new clue would be waiting. The police wanted to send in a bomb squad to treat it as a trap. No, Izzy insisted. You have to let me play my part. He's expecting me. If anyone else goes, he'll know we've broken the rules of his game and he'll disappear. We have to follow his script. Compromise was reached. Izzy would go, but she would be wired for sound and video, and Thorne and a tactical team would be shadowing her just out of sight. The university library was closed, a new crime scene in a city full of them. Izzy walked into the rare book room, the silence of the place profound. She followed the path described in the manuscript, the Dewey Decimal numbers leading her like a breadcrumb trail. She found the alchemy text. Tucked inside was not another riddle, but a photograph. It was an old, black-and-white photo of a young Alistair Finch standing proudly next to his mentor, Dr. Elias Vance. On the back was a handwritten address, the address of Vance's old, off-campus residence, a place that had been sealed and left untouched since his death 10 years ago. The trap was becoming clearer. Finch was leading her back to the scene of his first crime, the origin of his story. He wasn't just planning to kill her. He was planning to incorporate her into his own dark mythology. The tactical team surrounded the old, ivy-covered house as dusk began to fall. The place was dark, exuding an air of decay and forgotten secrets. Izzy, her heart pounding but her mind icily clear, approached the front door. It was unlocked. She entered a house that was a perfect time capsule of a decade ago. Dust covered everything, but the books, the papers, the pipe on the mantelpiece, it was all as Elias Vance had left it. She followed the narrative of the manuscript, which led her up the grand, creaking staircase to the professor's study on the top floor of the room with the balcony. The study was just as the manuscript had described it. And sitting in the professor's chair, a glass of brandy in one hand and a condescending smile on his face, was Alistair Finch. He was not armed, at least not visibly. He looked like a king holding court in his own private throne room. "Detective Rossi," he said, his voice a smooth, satisfied purr. "You read my work beautifully. I knew you would not disappoint. Welcome to the epilogue." "It's over, Alistair," Izzy said, her own voice steady, her hand resting on the grip of her holstered weapon. "We know about Vance. We found his blood. We have your confession, signed with your own." Finch laughed, a dry, academic chuckle. "That wasn't a confession, my dear detective. That was an author's signature, a mark of authenticity. I've been waiting for a very long time for someone to appreciate the artistry of my first and finest work. Elias was brilliant, but he was a critic, a gatekeeper. He read my new manuscript, the one that would have been my masterpiece, and he called it a soulless imitation. He failed to see its genius. A bad review, you see, is something an author simply cannot abide." He stood and walked towards the open doors of the balcony, the place where his mentor had fallen. "I'm not going to kill you with a weapon, detective," he said, turning back to her. "That would be a vulgar, brutish ending, devoid of irony. No, the ending I have written for you is far more poetic." He pointed to a small, almost invisible tripwire near the entrance to the study. "That is connected to a small incendiary device in the archives below. When the tactical team you have so clumsily hidden in my garden finally storms the room, they will trip it. The house, a tinderbox of old books and dry wood, will go up in flames. You and I, the author and his ideal reader, will be consumed together in a funeral pyre of literature. Perfect, tragic ending. The author and his critic, united in death. He was a monster, but he was a monster with a plan. He had anticipated every move. But Izzy had read one chapter ahead. "It's a good ending, Alistair," she said, taking a slow step into the room, deliberately avoiding the wire. "It's dramatic, symbolic, but it has one major flaw." Finch raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh, and what is that?" "It's a cliché," Izzy said calmly. "The mad artist, consumed by his own creation. The fiery finale has been done 1,000 times. For a writer of your supposed genius, it's a disappointingly predictable third act. Your mentor was right. You are a soulless imitator. For the first time in their entire duel, Alistair Finch's composure shattered. His face contorted in a mask of pure, narcissistic rage. The one thing his ego could not withstand was a bad review. "You dare," he began, taking an involuntary, furious step towards her. In his rage, he forgot his own stage directions. His foot snagged the tripwire. A faint click echoed in the silent room. Finch's eyes widened in a moment of horrified realization. He had been so focused on his narrative, he had forgotten the mechanics of his own trap. Izzy didn't hesitate. She lunged not at Finch but at the heavy oak desk. With a surge of adrenaline, she shoved it with all her might. The desk slid across the polished floor and slammed into Finch, pinning him against the wall, away from the now open doorway. Seconds later, the world erupted. A deep whoosh from below signaled the incendiary device igniting, and a wave of heat and smoke billowed up the staircase. Thorne and his team, alerted by the click of the wire on Izzy's audio feed, stormed the house. They found Izzy holding Finch at gunpoint, the flames licking at the doorway of the study. The author was trapped, not by the police, but by the flaws in his own final story. Alistair Finch's trial was a formality. The evidence, combined with his own extensive, written confessions, painted a portrait of a brilliant mind curdled by bitterness and ego. He was a man who loved words more than people, who saw life as nothing more than raw material for his dark art. Months later, the city of Havenwood was healing. Izzy stood in a small, independent bookstore, the kind of place Alistair Finch would have both loved and despised. She ran her fingers over the spine of one of his early, forgotten novels. The case had left its mark on her. She had been forced to enter the mind of a monster, to speak his language, to think in his narrative patterns. She had won, she had outwritten him, but she felt a profound sense of sorrow. A sorrow for his victims, and a sorrow for a talent so immense that it had devoured its own creator, leaving behind nothing but a series of blood-stained manuscripts. She put the book back on the shelf, leaving the story to gather dust, and walked out into the cool, clear air of the city, leaving the world of fiction behind for the messy, unpredictable, and precious world of reality.